Welcome, my name's Dave Simmons, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion, and welcome to the third and at the moment final joint session between the Policy Exchange and Inclusion. The object in this time of large-scale reform is to really keep the welfare reform debate going with these seminars, and I think just the turnout here, as well as in the previous two, have been testament to the fact that people really do want to be carrying on talking and debating about the way forward. Now, I'm just here to as a quick introduction, and then I'll be handing over to Neil, who will be chairing the session. But of course, within welfare reform, the debate very often just concentrates on the supply side, you know, the nature and characteristics of unemployed people and how we increase employability. But you need two to tango, as Anton Jabek has discovered over the recent months. And of course, which means that in this session, we're going to be concentrating a bit more on the demand side. And just one stat before we kick off. Before the recession, there were 2.3 people chasing every vacancy. Now, last month's stats, 5.3 people chasing every vacancy. And of course, if you go to some parts of the country, that is considerably higher. So the role of the demand side in affecting the performance of government programs and reform is critical to look at. So to debate that here today, we have got four eminent speakers in this field. First of all, Richard Excel, who is the Senior Policy Officer for the TUC. Sajid Javid MP for Bromsgrove, who is on the Department for Work and Pensions Select Committee. Ian Mulhern, who's the Director for the Social Market Foundation, and finally not least, Sean Williams, who's the Managing Director for G4S Welfare to Work. So thank you very much for coming along today to contribute your thoughts to this debate, and thanks also to G4S for supporting and sponsoring this seminar. So over to you, Neil. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I think this is an extremely timely seminar. It's great to have such a distinguished panel. Under the last Labour government, we had a certain set of employment policies. We had, for example, the jobs guarantee. We had regional development agencies. Under this government, the landscape is changing quite quickly. You have every work program. You have attempts going back to the enterprise allowance to encourage self-employment. But I think we have an interesting kind of open question about the future of, as Dave said, the kind of demand side of the welfare question. The government here are making a number of changes to existing policies. They're introducing local enterprise partnerships to replace the RDAs. But I think it's still a very open question. What, if anything, should be done on the demand side of the welfare question? To start us off, I'm going to ask Richard from the TUC to kick off with his comments, and the other speakers, and then towards the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. So without any further ado, over to you, Richard. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Chair. Just move the microphone over. Thanks very much for inviting me along today. And I started off when I was thinking about where the jobs going to come from by looking at where the jobs came from in the recovery from the last two recessions. And there the answer was pretty much the public sector and financial services. And well, certainly under the current administration, the public sector is not going to be providing the jobs growth over the next 5 years. And financial services, there may be some growth there, but it's a bit dodgy. So where else is it going to be coming from? And to think about that, you need to put this a bit in the macro context. And what's been happening in the recovery so far has been, well, GDP growth's doing okay. If you look at the first 3 quarters of this year and the last quarter of last year, we've got a growth rate that's above the long-term trend. We've seen unemployment, it's now 20,000 lower than it was in July. Inactivities, 83,000 lower. The employment rate has risen slightly from 17.5% to 17.8%. So you certainly can't say that the outlook for the immediate outlook for growth or jobs is in any way bad. We're not living in a time of immediate gloom right now. But on the other hand, we're not seeing really healthy jobs recovery, the sort that we need to get back to the 75% employment rate that we had before the recession began. What we've seen is a recession that was less damaging to employment than most commentators expected. And certainly, unemployment briefly touched 2.5 million. It was 1 month when it was over 2.5 million. And 2.5 million, I've got to say, was the lower end of my estimated range of unemployment for the recession. So that was a pretty good performance. Now, what I think was happening during the recession was there was quite a bit of labour hoarding going on. A lot of employers were hanging on to valued staff in the hope of being able to call on them when the recession came to an end. And the contrast with the States, where negative growth translated rapidly into massive job losses, is really quite startling, especially as we always think of ourselves as having a very similar labour market to America's. But the other side of labour hoarding, of course, is first of all that it hit productivity. So if you look at some of the productivity figures in the recent red paper on growth, that's reflecting the 2009 figures are to some extent reflecting the labour hoarding that went on, and it means that there's less scope for employers to take people on in the recovery. The bright spot's been manufacturing, especially manufacturing exports, which have done really very well indeed. And if this had been a recession 50 years ago, that would be extremely encouraging, because manufacturing was still about 1/3 of UK employment, and certainly for decent blue-collar jobs is vitally important. But of course, 70% of the economy is in services now, so we need more than manufacturing growth. And so that means that first of all, maintaining our performance in exports, manufacturing exports in particular, is going to be important. We need to keep the competitive value of the pound. We need to build on the growth that's taken place so far. I mean, possibly the most encouraging factor so far is the growth in exports to non-traditional markets, and the BRICS in particular, where previously they've been very bad. And the fact that UK businesses have been successfully exporting to India and China is very good news indeed, especially as they're less likely than our traditional markets to fall into declining growth next year. So that's the macro context. The micro context is going to be equally challenging. As I say, because of the labour hoarding, there's going to be fewer jobs coming up in the private sector than we might have expected in previous recessions. At the same time, we're not going to be getting the jobs in the public sector to take up the slack. So this is going to make the task for organisations like G4S very challenging indeed, especially as a higher proportion of participants are going to be people from disadvantaged groups. So we're going to see more and more people with health conditions and impairments who are going to be failed the tougher work capability assessment and therefore coming on to job seekers allowance. Even if they're not, even if they are counted as being able to work, they are people who genuinely got health conditions, and it is more difficult to get people with health conditions, even minor health conditions, into jobs. We know that the experience of people who qualify for incapacity benefits but then volunteer for job seekers allowance. So this is an exceptionally motivated group. It still takes them about twice as long to get jobs as people with no health condition or impairment at all who are on JSA. So that's going to be a difficulty. We're going to see more and more lone parents coming off the income support and going on to job seekers allowance, and they're only going to be available for jobs that fit in with the childcare that they're able to get, and childcare funding is being cut back, so that's going to be more difficult. Obviously, from the trade union movement, I'm concerned that we've gone back to what seems to be Britain's default position of having no job creation element to employment policy. We were enthusiastic supporters of the Future Jobs Fund and the job guarantees, and given that the private sector is not going to be creating so many jobs, that's a bit of a worry. It's good that the work programme is going to rationalise employment programmes. It's often forgotten the last government rationalised employment programmes as well when it brought in the New Deal. It's just they were hit by the global recession, and they threw everything at the wall and saw what stuck, which is a lot better than not doing anything in response to it. But now that we've had a bit of time to calm down from that, it does need tidying up. And as someone who specialises in this area, there was a point last year when a colleague and I had to go through a special exercise of just listing everything that the government was doing and having a look through some old announcements just to make sure there wasn't anything that we'd forgotten about. So keeping in touch with all that was difficult. So great that we're getting a more rational programme. I'm worried that the work programme is designed to be cheaper than the programmes it's replacing. One of the things that I have learned from observing 20 years of employment policy is that programmes that are run on the cheap tend to be less effective than those that have had more money put into them. You don't solve everything by throwing money at it, but it does help. Final point, I think that the key task for the next 10 years of employment policy is how to deal with the fact that 40 years ago, 90% of prime-age men and 80% of men aged 50 plus were in employment. Now it's 80% of prime-aged men and 65% of those aged 50 plus. Now, there is counterbalancing that good news on women's employment, but the fact that male employment over a long term under governments of both major parties has declined, even at the age when people are most likely to be employed, is something that everyone should worry about. And I'm willing to take seriously any ideas that people have about that. So, if it's possible that benefits are having an effect, I don't think that is the explanation, but it's something that should be taken seriously as an idea. One thing that often gets ignored in the discussion about that problem is employer behaviour, and I think part of the problem is employers resistance to recruiting older workers and to recruiting people with health problems. So I think that needs to be thrown into the mix as well. It's useful that the government does recognise that there needs to be a special focus on disability, but I think they should be having a special focus on middle-aged and older workers as well. So the prospects are, I think, poised at the moment. We've got a reasonable but not overwhelming recovery. Employment policies that have got a certain rationality, but a feature that I worry about. So both the macro and the micro put us in a position where if the global economy continues to recover, we've got some hope of seeing employment rates recovering at the level in the OBR report. If it doesn't, I think the outlook is a bit gloomy. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Richard. It's an excellent sketch of the landscape, and you touched on something I think is absolutely fascinating there, particularly the collapse of the male employment rate over the last 30 years. Once you see it, it's just sort of, you can't stop thinking about it. And you posed some good questions there. It's job creation for who? People of different ages, different sexes, different places, and an important question also about value for money in employment creation. So without any further ado, we're going to then move on to Salim Javid, MP.
Okay. Thank you, Neil. First of all, thank you for setting up this forum today. I think it's a vitally important topic. It's very pretty topical right now and will be for many years. So thank you also for inviting me. Just to correct one thing in the introduction, as of last week, I'm no longer a member of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. I did resign because of this panel, but it's because I've become a PPS to, once you become PPS, you have to leave select committees to John Hayes, the Minister of State for Further Education, Skills and Lifelong Learning, which in itself I don't think is too disconnected from what we're discussing today in any case. Before I became a Member of Parliament in May this year, for 20 years I was an investment banker in the city. And I used to think, especially the last 3 or 4 years, that being an investment banker was probably the most disliked career choice of the general public. But that was, of course, before I became a Member of Parliament. Things are a bit different now. So when I speak today, I'll also speak from my experience of working on economic issues and with investors, particularly private equity investors, and how they look at the economy and job creation. But I thought, just in this short introduction, what I really would just speak about for a few minutes is clearly the government is carrying out a radical shake-up of welfare. And although this is the supply side, I think it's all very important about how it links into demand and how we create a work ethic amongst people. Because I think what the government is doing is nothing short of, it's not just about enhancing people's earnings and giving them help to try and live off their own earnings as opposed to living off the state. But it's also about, I think, about recreating or refining a work ethic back in Britain. And restoring people's dignity in labour and self-respect from actually having a job. It is more than just about the money that you can earn and the food that you can put on the table. To put the problem in perspective, the last decade, the government welfare spending on working age benefits has increased by 45% in real terms. And so that's the bill today, as of this year, will be £85 billion in those types of benefits. Yet over the same decade, a number of independent research has shown that poverty in many working households actually increased. Social mobility was actually decreased. And today we have a situation where we have 5 million people receiving some sort of working age benefit. And of that 5 million, some 1.4 million have been receiving such benefits for 9 of the last 10 years. So it creates a very entrenched, deep problem. And some people, particularly the ones that have been receiving for so many years, actually think some of the hardest to help to try and get off benefits and back into work. The centerpiece of the government's reforms is clearly around the whole idea of universal credit. we could call that the sort of that part of it is the sort of carrot approach, which is to say that the system currently is terribly complex, and it needs to be replaced by a single benefit, which governments call universal credit. And the reason for that is just simply that so any benefit recipient, working age benefit recipient, knows exactly where they stand, but most importantly, that they know that if they accept a job, whether it's a part-time job or a full-time job, that they will be better off by taking that job than by staying on benefits. And that in itself, it sounds very simple, clearly, surely someone should be better off by taking work than not taking work, but that is not the evidence in many, many cases of the current system, where when you take the tax rate and benefits withdrawal combined, many people would only get to keep maybe around 10% of any extra earnings that they would earn by taking employment. From my own experience, I recently made a visit a few months ago to my own job centre in my constituency of Bromsgrove, and I asked the jobs advisors there if someone walked in and said that they'd been offered a part-time job, maybe 10 hours a week, £10 an hour, would they actually be better off so how would you be able to tell them if they would be better off, and how long would it take you to do such a calculation? They said, well, first of all, because the benefits are paid by so many different agencies, the Treasury or the local authority and so forth, that it will take them at least, in their own words, at least an hour to make the calculations about whether someone would be better off by taking part-time employment. But they said what would happen in most cases, because it's taken them an hour, but once they've actually worked it out and they tell the welfare recipient, they often, there's not much credibility in what they're saying, because many of the welfare recipients just feel that if it's taken these professionals an hour to work this out, then can I really rely on this? And they'd rather not take the risk of taking the job in the first place. So I think that part of the reforms is the centerpiece, and I think is absolutely critical to get right. And clearly there's also a part of a sort of stick approach as well, the conditionality attached to the benefits. There already is, but I think it's fair to say this government will be going further. There will be an expectation to do a certain amount of community work for job seekers, allowance recipients, and there will be withdrawal of benefits if they refuse to take the job that they've been offered or are not actively looking for a job. And there will also be caps on benefits. The housing benefit cap was well talked of recently, but also there'll be a cap on the total amount of benefits a household can receive £500 a week, which is worked out at the average median wage for a working family today, which is about £27,000 on a net basis, which is about £35,000 on a gross basis, equivalent income. So I think these are all part and parcel of the changes that the approach the government is taking, in recognition that not just the previous government, but I think it's fair to say successive governments have not really tackled this problem. And for once now, I think we have a government and a Secretary of State in particular that is determined to get this right. And then I'll just finish off on something I'm sure we talk about later. Is how one side is dealing with what I've just talked about, but then clearly we need to have the jobs in the economy that people from welfare would need to get into. My view really is that how government could do this is really I just take a very sort of, let's say, general view of things on the following basis, which I don't think it's the government's job to create jobs. I actually don't think government can create jobs other than the small jobs in number in the public sector. Jobs are created by private business people, businessmen and women, by entrepreneurs, by foreign investors. And I think the role that the government has is that first and foremost is to have a stable economy that opens Britain back up for business again. And secondly, to invest in those things that private sector clearly cannot or lags behind, such as infrastructure, whether it's transport infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, things like that, that can assist. But jobs ultimately need to come from the private sector, and that's how, with that and with the welfare reforms, we're really going to get Britain working again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for putting this discussion about job creation into context. That was a strong statement of what I think is probably still the dominant paradigm in the welfare debate, which is a broadly free market, market-driven approach to reducing constraints the government puts on overall employment creation. But there are a whole range of motives that I think people, reasons why people talk about employment creation, and I wonder if our next two speakers we might get into some of these. It seems to me there are three sort of main reasons. People sometimes want to talk about employment creation for sort of regional reasons. They want to talk about areas where some people will move out to areas where there are more jobs, but will remain behind communities where there seems to be quite long-term unemployment, very high rates of unemployment. So it's sort of a regional question. There's a role for job creation, some people argue, in being a kind of backstop for conditionality, part of a kind of activation policy that you are able to say, you will take a job. In fact, here is a job that you will take, which might be a backstop to those kind of arguments. Or thirdly, there might be some people argue for job creation for supported employment for certain types of people. We're thinking things like Remploy, where if we remember the discussion where the Treasury offered to replace Remploy with welfare benefits, and the people running it didn't want to do that because it was important. They thought for the dignity of people that they had a job, not just the money. So lots of different motives behind these arguments that people sometimes make for employment creation. So I wonder if in our next two speakers we can pick up on some of those different arguments. But anyway, enough from me. Over to Sean.
Am I going next?
Sorry, I completely disagree. We were going to get to Ian.
Okay. Fine. Fine. Who would you like to hear first? Thanks very much, Neil. And I'm glad that you said some of those slightly more sceptical noises about demand-side policy, because that's kind of where I'm going to come from. I think usually I'm sort of the villain of the piece for raining on the parade slightly when it comes to make work and things like that. But so I'll set out a few thoughts about that, and then Neil, some of those interesting questions you raised, maybe I'll pick up briefly at the end. I think the starting point for our discussion is that what we kind of came to over the last 15 years was a broad consensus that work-first approaches are pretty effective in normal economic times at preventing people from slipping into long-term unemployment, and therefore preventing long-term disengagement, and that's really been the major thing that we've learned. But in a recession we face a very different kind of problem. It's a collapse in aggregate labour demand, and that raises new questions about what the role of policy is. It's qualitatively different from what we were trying to do when we were trying to activate people or stop people from slipping into long-term unemployment in benign economic conditions. So it seems to me that in that situation policy really has two choices. First of all, it can try to do something with the excess labour supply and wait for things to pick up in the broader economy, or it can try and do something about the lack of labour demand and try and tinker with that and do something to mop up the supply that way. So they're the two things you can do. There's really nothing else you can do. So really, taking the first of those, doing something with the excess labour supply, I mean, in a sense, that's what we tried in the 80s and 90s recessions, when we let people slip into long-term unemployment and didn't really activate them, push them off into work. And the consequence was the IB stopped. Very slow offloads from IB created massive costs, human costs and economic costs, permanent loss of capacity in the labour market, human tragedy, and something that was extremely expensive, as we all now know. So that didn't really work. That's why everybody looks to labour demand policies. So what about boosting it? Can we do something there? Well, we did try that also in the 80s with programs like the community program, but evidence really on these things is pretty limited, and what evidence there is suggests that such policies are not really very effective. There's two broad ways in which you can try and tinker with labour demand. The first is you could create jobs. Government can create jobs that are not in the private sector, that are nothing like real economy jobs, as it were. And the benefits of that is it doesn't displace private activity. So you can have street sweeping or digging holes and filling them in again, or whatever it might be. But the problem with these kind of jobs is that the skills that an individual gains in doing them are not in any way relevant to probably their work history and background, or to the jobs that they might get when the economy picks up. And it's for that reason, and also the reason that these jobs take up people's time and prevent them doing job search, for those two reasons we tend to find that these things are a bit of a waste of money. And in fact, a few researchers have commented on these things. Jochen Kluver says, in 2006, says, these public sector job creation programs are rarely effective and frequently detrimental regarding participants' employment prospects. And there's a range of other such conclusions as well from other researchers. So really, those kind of public sector job creation programs, and there I'd include probably the Future Jobs Fund in that, the evidence isn't particularly auspicious on their effectiveness in the past. So what about the other kind? Let's think about, well, what about private sector job creation? Can we use employment subsidies in a generalised fashion to boost labour demand? And here, really, the massive danger is that you just get displacement of existing activity, and you get huge dead weight costs involved in subsidising jobs that most of them would have existed already. One particular study sort of showed that 90% of money spent in this way on generalised employment subsidies was dead weight. So crucially, what it's doing is what it's not doing is adding anything to the aggregate labour demand. So it's not solving the problem that it's setting out to solve, and that's why that one doesn't work either. So overall, job creation is, in a generalised sense at least, is a bit of a red herring. The one exception may be that if you are targeting employment subsidies at the most disengaged people in the labour market, it doesn't affect the aggregate amount of labour demand, but it does kind of shuffle the pack. It spreads the pain, and it perhaps prevents certain groups from becoming completely disengaged from the labour market. So it may have a benefit there, but it's not tackling the problem it's about to tackle, which was to solve the mass unemployment problem. So back then to supply, is there anything else we can do with supply while we wait for demand to pick up in the broader economy? And we can't just park people, otherwise we get the hugely costly problem we have at the moment. So really where I come out on this is that it presents a unique opportunity for investment in human capital and skills and training. The cost of doing skills, or investing in skills, is high in benign economic conditions because people should be working and being productive, and so the opportunity cost, as economists call it, of taking them out of that productive employment and training them is high. When there's a lot of labour lying idle, that opportunity cost is lower, so it makes much more sense for a government to invest in human capital strategies at that point in the cycle. That mops up some of that supply of labour and also raises the human capital stock, which is good for the future productivity of the economy. The challenge is to make sure that interventions on that front are effective and worthwhile, and that's why I think the way forward is to develop some kind of outcome-based system for funding these things. And that really is, I think, the only solution to the problem in a situation of slack labour demand. Just coming back to a couple of your points, Neil, you said they could be used to tackle regional problems. Well, generally, the evidence tends to show that in regional problems of unemployment are driven mainly by the labour market characteristics of the people who live there. Problems of residential sourcing, where people who have huge labour market disadvantage end up in cheap housing that is away from employment opportunities. It's not necessarily causal where they are and whether they can get into employment. It's usually something to do with their labour market characteristics. If you were to move them to the biggest and most vibrant labour market in the country, in London, they'd probably still find themselves unemployed. So in a way, I'm suspicious about those. There is a place issue, but it's not as big as people imagine. Backstop to conditionality, I think the evidence there is pretty sketchy, actually, from the US, that these things are effective. It just generally forces people off benefits entirely, which creates poverty problems and other problems. Supported employment, I think that falls into that category of perhaps trying to get people who are most disadvantaged into work. So I think those programs can be effective, but it's very hard to generalise, and it's all about the design, and that's why outcome-based funding is quite crucial.
Brilliant, Ian, that's excellent answer to lots of those questions. Very, very interesting. Sounds like there's a sort of scope for a think tank paper there about how to fund skills in such a way you don't waste all your money.
Don't get there first, we've got it.
Brilliant. On which note Now in right order, over to you, Sean.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess I'm here with two hats on. The first hat would be, as G4S are the second largest private sector employer in the world, we think we know something around job creation and around the employment piece. And secondly, I'm here as Managing Director of G4S's Welfare to Work team. G4S has successfully competed to be on the work programme framework in 7 regions. We are new entrants to the Welfare to Work space. We have a model which leverages our expertise in supply chain management, our expertise in informatics systems, our expertise in taking complex moving parts and bringing them together. And we couple that then with a supply chain organisations from the voluntary, public and private sectors who are experts in delivery. We believe that actually what will transform Welfare to Work delivery in the UK is not trying to go in and reinvent the wheel. Actually, most of the services to help long-term unemployed people into decent, sustainable jobs exist. What's missing is a way of managing those organisations better and organising them better, and that's really what we think G4S brings to the piece. I'm not going to talk a great deal about job creation from the public sector. I tend to agree with Ian that it doesn't work and it's misplaced. And I think it doesn't work for a number of reasons. And I could give some macroeconomic kind of reasons, but I won't. I actually instead give an example of a social enterprise which was set up in the Northwest to help workless people to set up a social enterprise taxi company. So, obviously a demand for taxis, it took people off the register and gave them a job. But they actually found that a subsidised taxi company made quite a few of the existing taxi companies quite cross in the area. You have massive problems either with displacements. If the work is worth doing, the chances are that somebody is making a living doing that work and you crowd them out. Or the work isn't worth doing. And again, then I would suggest that if the work is not worth doing, paying people to do it is not really good for them because it's not meaningful. And it's certainly not good for society. I think kind of the third challenge on job creation, which we saw with things like intermediate labour markets, is where you can make them meaningful. Scornful, I think you can make them more meaningful than perhaps a caricature of. But if you do, then they tend to become quite sticky. So those individuals, if they're happy in an intermediate labour market position, if they're doing something which keeps them going. So an example of this would be I spent some time running employment programs in Australia where they have work for the dole, and you would often see individuals who would go and do some work, say looking after the bush, and those individuals would then never want to get a paid job because they were enjoying what they were doing. So I think there were all sorts of problems with public sector job creation. So I think then where are the jobs going to come from? I think we need then to look at private sector job creation and what policymakers and others can do in order to stimulate that. And I'd just like to give a statistic which really struck me the first time I heard it, and I've been sharing it with people ever since, which is that if every sole trader in this country took on one person, then we would have no worklessness in the UK. So again, I talk of working for a very large employer, but actually we know through employment zones, new deals, private sector-led new deal, action teams for jobs, the various other initiatives that we've seen Flex New Deal, 80 to 90% of those jobs come from micro-employers. So again, this is not actually about very large employers taking on a lot more people. Actually, it's about quite small employers, sole traders, micro-businesses taking on people. So for me, a lot of the question is then, one is how do you start to set up those micro-businesses, and how do you then create conditions where micro-businesses take on more people? And again, I think there's various theoretical arguments you can have about that, around taxation regimes, etc. And I think all of those have their place. But again, I'd like to talk from a welfare to work expert's perspective. Another figure which struck me on employment zones, in the early days saw people who had been out of work for at least 18 months. In many cases, they saw individuals who have been worked out of work for 10, 15 years. Very disadvantaged, the most disadvantaged areas of the UK. 20% of employment zones outcomes were into self-employment. So actually this was taking a group of individuals who you might have thought not hugely entrepreneurial, or not hugely motivated, or hugely able to start their own businesses, and in actual fact all those prejudices would be completely wrong. 20% of those individuals were helped to start their own businesses. Some of that was around the grey economy. So some of those individuals were running businesses and not declaring them, essentially. And again, I would ask, why would a business do that? Because one key thing that a business has to do is advertise if it wants to grow and expand. And I think the obvious reason that those businesses remained on the wrong side of the taxation system, on the right side, was actually to do with our benefit system. It was actually about a broken benefit system, which meant that people were, if people said, well, I helped paint my neighbour's front room, and I cut the grass for the person across the road, actually if they declared that money, if they declared that as income, actually they wanted to expand that business, the benefit system would work against them. Either they would be actively worse off, or they'd be just a very little bit better off, or most probably actually, particularly you see with fluctuating income, the system just would not be able to cope, and the housing benefit would be affected, they'd start to be rent arrears, etc. So I think there's a key point around where the jobs will come from, which will be welfare to work programs can get up to 20% of outcomes in actually setting people up in self-employment. And if you put a benefit system around that, which then encourages those individuals stop being workless individuals, stop being a cost to the state, and actually start to become employers themselves. So I think that's a critical piece. I think one of the things then which also puts off both job seekers becoming self-employed, but also micro-employers, it's not so much the cost of taking on an employee in terms of the pure cash. The real thing is the bureaucracy in taking on the first employee, which is massive for individuals. And I think there's a real role for work program providers and others in terms of taking some of that bureaucratic burden off small employers in order for them to be able to take on their first person and grow and expand their businesses. And I think there's clearly a policy role for the government in making that as easy as possible. And there are policies, for example, good policies like ensuring that businesses have pension arrangements for their staff, which if you are a sole trader who's looking to take on the first member of staff, some of those things are going to make it even more difficult for you to do so. I guess I would just come back then to kind of the three maybe regions for job creation. Employment creation regionally, I would tend to share Ian's point of view that actually this is about promoting entrepreneurialism in those regions, and actually that's about those individuals, and again it's a supply side intervention. It's a supply side intervention that will make the demand side increase. As a backstop for conditionality, I think some of the most successful programs we've seen in welfare to work internationally, the most successful program we've seen internationally is Work for the Dole in Australia. I've also already mentioned some of the problems with that. I think that those are very expensive programs to run. I think they have good shakeout failures for 20% of the people they see, and then they completely fail 80% of the people they see. It's probably not sensible to run a program for 20% of people which fails the 80%. I guess one reason which wasn't mentioned, which I can see more of a justification for job creation, is in keeping people
be earning huge amounts of money, and therefore the returns to them of moving vast distances and upheaving the upheaval involved is probably not going to be worth it. So we have to be realistic, but mobility is part of the release mechanism that enables those employment opportunities to spread over large geographic areas.
Richard, I sort of sense that you might disagree with that.
Well, I think I probably agree with more than you might expect. Something came up recently, actually, where I thought Ian Duncan Smith was being treated unfairly was to some extent was those comments about get on the bus if you live in South Wales Valleys and haven't got a job. Now, to some extent, part of what's needed is changing people's horizons. And in France, they've had some very interesting experiments where you have someone who works for the Public Employment Service, which essentially is a social worker, who spends some time with an individual, teaching them about getting up at 7 o'clock every morning and being willing to travel an hour, and saying, if you want jobs in take someone in Deptford, for instance, if you want jobs in the West End, this is the bus stop that you have to go to get the bus in there, and points like that. And they found that can work quite well. So I felt to some extent, Duncan Smith was being treated unfairly over those comments. The point is, however, this is really the worst possible time to be trying to deal with problems like unemployment black spots. Because right now, even if you're increasing the employability of the people in those areas, a couple of years ago, there might have been the jobs for them to travel to get. Nowadays, if you live in Aberdare, the jobs aren't there in Cardiff either, whereas they were a couple of years ago. And we have seen during the recovery of a few years ago, previous unemployment black spots beginning to claw their way out. I was born in Liverpool, and there's one of the most disadvantaged bits of Liverpool is Garston. The most disadvantaged bit of Garston is known locally as Under the Bridge, because it's this area surrounded by railway lines, and every road into that area you had to go under a railway bridge to get there. It was the classic, extremely deprived community. Massive unemployment rates, every social problem that you could imagine. What amazed me when I went, when I was doing some work in Liverpool in 2007, was I found out that Under the Bridge was recovering during the employment recovery of that period. Because Liverpool, for the first time in my entire life, was actually growing economically, and that economic growth in Liverpool was feeding through even to the most disadvantaged areas. So I'd say that you can deal with disadvantaged areas by increasing the employability of the people who live there, but as I say, now's really not the time to try it out as an experiment.
Any further questions? Take this gentleman halfway down in the
So, Constantine Montecas. Can I just ask the panel, because there seems to be a disconnect. I mean, the UK continues to be one of the most sought-after destinations for cross-border labour, i.e. we welcome every year a large number of people coming here to work, who indeed successfully work. And yet here we are discussing unemployment and the difficulty of people to find work from the normal UK workforce. It seems to me that there is a gap here. Either it's a skills gap or a motivation gap, because we are able to employ, it seems, a lot of people from overseas. Do you people want to sort of comment on that?
It's your first.
Yeah. Is that microphone working?
I wonder if that microphone is working. Do you want
Does this
to
one
do
work?
back on the bottom? That one is working.
Okay. Yeah. I'll start the following way. In my constituency of Bromsgrove, during the election campaign, as I was meeting people, I met a lot of local employers, And my constituency, by the way, actually has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, and is 2.7%. And so a lot of local employers and sort of technology firms as well as farmers. And I went to see one particular farmer, which this visit particularly stuck in my mind, and I think goes directly to the question the gentleman asked. This local farm, run by a local farmer, been there for over 50 years, has about 60 employees. And as you can imagine, being a farm, it's sort of unskilled to low skilled type work. Of the 60 employees, 56 are from Eastern Europe, mostly Polish. And I was very interested in this and to learn more. And as he explained to me, he said, I just cannot for the life of me find local people that want to work. Despite having low unemployment rate in my constituency, I saw over 2,000 people on job seekers allowance. And most of them are aged between 18 and 25, and that's the typical age group that he's hiring. I said most of the people that will turn up for interviews are there because they're being forced to come. They don't really want to be there. And even if I've sort of offered them a job, he said, I can tell you that 7 or 8 out of 10 of them won't turn up for the first day, and out of the 2 that do, one of them will sort of not turn up after the first week. He also, when you talk about motivation, he also explained that, he said, if the job starts at 9 o'clock, he said, my Polish employees are here at 8 a.m. getting ready for work. And at 9 a.m. they're ready to go, typically they started a bit earlier. If the job finishes at 5 o'clock, they finish at 5, and they will leave and pack up and end the day and leave the farm at about 6. But he said, what he's found to be with local employees that don't really want to be there, they'll start there and leave as quickly as they can, take longer breaks and so forth. So motivation, I think, is a big issue. And I think that helps explain why in the last decade, in the previous government, I think I'm correct to say it's about 2 million new jobs were created, actually 2 million additional jobs in the private sector. And of those, 88% went to foreign-born workers. So the jobs were here, they have been here, and obviously there's more trouble after the recession and so forth, but even before the recession, 10 years of jobs growth under the previous government, but still the jobs were going to foreign-born workers. So I think motivation is an issue, as well as skills. And we can talk about motivation, how you improve that for a long time. A lot of it has to do with skills, but I think a lot also has to do with the welfare changes, those types of changes, and the specific approach I talked about earlier.
Okay, so there is a argument you often hear is that this shows that the problems on the supply side. Do either of you want to?
Yeah, I think I actually, I agree with most of that, but I don't think I would add something which I think is critical, which is not motivation is not a attribute you either possess or don't possess, or you're born with. Or comes from being Polish, or motivation comes from the systems that you work within. I think if you looked at the debate of being unemployed in Poland and compared that to working minimum wage in the UK, and then looked at the rates you get if you're unemployed in the UK compared to working minimum wage in the UK, you'd find a very, very big and motivating differential on the one hand, and you won't find that big motivating differential on the other. So if you want people to go and work 40 hours a week picking fruit, you need to make sure that they're genuinely more than, say, 50p a week better off by doing that, or in some cases worse off. And again, I don't think that motivation is some mysterious force. I think that's pretty easy to actually get benefit reform. Benefit reform is complicated, but I think if you get benefit reform right, you will solve 90% of the motivation problem overnight. I think the second thing then, motivation is not just an economic issue, although as I said, the majority of it is. We then do need to look at the environments those individuals have been brought up in. We have let worklessness become endemic for people. We've suffered from right into generational worklessness, and if you come from a culture of working, which is very strong, the parents work, grandparents work, you have a lot more social capital. You are much more used to the expectation of going out to work. And again, for me, that is a supply side intervention. That's an awful lot of what really good welfare to work providers do in the UK, which is normalise work, show people that they will be better off, and people will genuinely be a lot better off. That will make a huge difference. Explaining that to individuals, supporting individuals. Motivation is not something you have or you don't have. Motivation is something that is learned, which systems are.
Richard, you look like you.
Yeah. I'll certainly accept that argument for a high minimum wage. What I'm a bit concerned about is the biased samples that we're talking about. Because, you know, when you look at these Polish workers on the farm, I mean, you know, these are by definition a highly motivated group. They've crossed half a continent to work there. So, you know, it's not surprising that they are an exceptionally mobile and motivated group. It's a mistake to imagine that the reason we have unemployment is because of a problem with the motivation of unemployed people. Unemployment has gone up 700,000 in the last couple of years. It hasn't gone up because we have 700,000 more people with a motivation problem than we had a few years ago. It's gone up because of a deficiency of demand in the economy. If you look at every single study that's ever been done in this country and other countries of the attitudes to work of unemployed people, the vast majority have a strong and continuing commitment to the values of work. Some of the studies show that unemployed people have a higher commitment to the values of work than people who are actually in work. If people were choosing unemployment because they're motivated to prefer leisure over labour, then you would expect their levels of happiness to be higher than people who are in employment. Notoriously, people in unemployment have very high levels of mental ill health, show up very badly on studies of levels of happiness, life satisfaction. We don't have massive unemployment because we've got an underclass. Possibly America may have an issue about an underclass. I'm willing to accept that things are different over there. But studies of the values of people in this country show that unemployed people not only have the same attitudes to work, they have the same set of values as people in employment. And they don't form a different class in that way. If we tried to motivate people into employment by driving down the level of benefits, we would drastically increase the amount of poverty that we have, including child poverty, because the poverty of children can't be disentangled from the poverty of their parents. It's an easy line in the pub of a night to say, you know, so-and-so off the estate, he hasn't worked in his entire life, and he boasts about the easy life he's got on the dole. A, that person is a small minority amongst unemployed people, and B, when you get talking to people like that, because I used to be a barman who was serving pints to people who were talking to people like that, and being an unusual person, a left-wing barman, I would, as they were crying into their beer, instead of saying, oh, well, women are all like that, I'd say, why do you tell everyone that you're living the life of Riley, when I can see you only come in here at 5 to 11 one night a week because you can only afford the one pint, and they would either refuse to admit that was the case and still pretend that they were living the life of Riley when any objective person would see they wouldn't, or they would admit they didn't want to seem like a failure. And if you're an unemployed person, God, you seem like a failure to everyone, including yourself. Telling everyone that actually you're pulling a fast one on the system, everyone else is the mug, is a way of keeping your self-respect. So I'm not inclined to blame unemployed people for their unemployment. Why we've got people from other countries doing some work? Well, to some extent, that they are creating and doing work that people in this country wouldn't do. There is that issue to a small extent, and especially in agriculture, actually. The studies have shown that there's a small effect that way in agriculture. Although 88% of people of the jobs went to people who weren't born in the UK, 50% went to people who are UK citizens. I've noticed that Fraser Nelson and other commentators always quote the 88% figure. They never quote the figure for people's citizenship. What you've got is a lot of people who are UK citizens but weren't born in this country taking up this job, and that's got a lot to do with demographic changes. So I'm wary about this discourse, which gets used to argue for lower benefit levels and cracking down on unemployed people, when I don't think that the evidence justifies it.
There's a question, the gentleman in the third row from the back on the right-hand side. Forward. Yeah, in that room. Move a bit forward. Yeah.
Hi, Mark Linwood from the IEA. I just wanted to explore some of these motivational points, and accepting in either case neither a Bronze Grove farm or whichever bar that Richard worked in, accepting that anecdote is not the singular of data. But it does strike me that there are some points that we can make here about motivation. I want to frame this in a way which isn't a sort of tepid like get on your bike, but nevertheless raises, I think, some important issues. The first is that even with Ian Douglas Smith's welfare reforms, and I'd like Sardi's thoughts on this, my understanding is that the withdrawal rate is still going to be about 63%. That's saying that the effective tax that you're paying is going to be about 63%. That doesn't strike me as providing a great incentive to become a fruit picker in Bromsgrove if you're facing that marginal rate of taxation. It's better than it being 100% or 110%, which has been in some cases, but that isn't a particularly substantial switch. The second point, which I'd like the panel's views on, which at the risk of sounding as if I do wish to create pointless public sector jobs, I wonder if there is a way that workfare can be made to work. That if there is actually not just a financial incentive about whether or not to work, but there is, if you like, a leisure question. Would you prefer to be a fruit picker for 40 hours on 10 grand a year, or to not have to work 9.5 grand a year? You've got a much more leisure at the 9.5 grand a year. I'm not suggesting you're using that sitting around just watching television all day, but you could have more leisure, which is generally something that people value. So is there a way that we could create some sort of work programme which doesn't displace present jobs, but gets these people into the habit of saying, if you wish to claim these benefits, you will have to turn up at certain places at certain fixed times. You'll have to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. You will have to do the following specific tasks that are set to you. Now, I can see that that sounds like it is making people dig holes and fill them in again, but might not that actually begin to help the cultural problem of getting people used to having to turn up at certain times to do certain tasks? I'd like the panel's using both of those, the financial incentive and the labour incentive.
Very good question about job creation and workfare. Who wants to read it first?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, as you might have gathered, I have some different views to my colleague Richard here, but I don't think he was a barman in Bromsgrove. If I popped in for a beer, maybe I would start to change my views as well. But in terms of those 2 points, I mean, just take your latter one first. I think there is you're quite right to say changing some of the cultural attitudes towards work of people that are currently unemployed, I think is very important. And I think part of the government's initiative to try and do that is this example that if you are a job seeker, that you will be expected going forward to do at least, I think the government said, 30 hours a month for at least 4 weeks of, 30 hours a week for a minimum of 4 weeks of community work, where the idea is that more than if nothing else, that you get into the habit of having to get up early and going out all day, socialising, meeting people, and the whole sort of routine that comes with being in a job. Albeit that's the real job is community work, but it's still better than not doing that. So I do think that's an important part of it. The second thing, the withdrawal rate, I think you make a fair point. I mean, the government hasn't set the withdrawal rate yet. I think in the last discussion in Parliament, Incapacity has said somewhere between sort of 55 to 65%. But let's say it's even 65%. You get to keep 35 pence in every pound. I mean, clearly, I think yes. Would it be better to keep 45 pence in every pound, 50 pence in every pound? Absolutely. But I think that there has to be some balance struck with the cost, the exchequer of these schemes. But I think the key thing is that 35%, you're getting to keep 35 pence in every pound is still a lot better than keeping 5 or 10 pence in every pound. And then clearly, once the structure is set in place and we invested in the scheme, the technology that's required, then the withdrawal rate is actually something that can be played with. I think as well as withdrawal rate, the other thing to point out, I think is very important, is the earnings disregard. Well, we haven't set that yet, but that is the amount that you can earn whilst you're on benefits without it affecting your benefits at all. So in that case, you get to keep 100% of it before the withdrawal rate actually kicks in, and the withdrawal rate kicks in after the disregard. So I think that's important, and what the government has said as well there is that the earnings disregard will increase to the one that's implied in current level of benefits, and I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, you've written a bit about this recently as well. Yeah. Well, taking the conditionality point first, using it, I think that is the best economic justification for network schemes. But I think the evidence just shows that they don't really work to do that, mainly because they, the other aspect of the economic theory in this thing is search matching, and it lowers the time to search and therefore lowers the rate at which people get off benefits. They're also extremely expensive. It's actually much more expensive than just paying people their benefit. So that's why governments have tended to, both huge, have tended to focus on let's just pay their benefit and then use stick to get them to look for work, because the more they look, the more they are likely to get work. And that's why I think that make an excuse for that conditionality backstop, which is probably a bad idea. On marginal tax rates, I think there's this standard pie and triangle of what your level of out-of-work benefits are and how quickly you take them away. And I think we need to be very careful about saying that there's some sort of promised land once universal credit is coming in. I guess it's not talking about cutting levels of out-of-work benefit. And while this scheme will cost quite a bit of money, and I think a lot more money than people currently think, it's not going to be a huge amount more, which means that withdrawal rates are not going to be substantially lower. And while you get to keep the 35p in the pound, that's 35p of your net income. So if you add tax on top, you're actually looking at taking out very much less than that. So it's not nearly as good as it sounds. And the other point is that when people say you lose 90p in the pound, that's for a very small group of people at the moment in the tax and benefit system. For the standard, for the typical family in the working family at the moment in the UK, they will see a 6 pence in the pound rise in the marginal deduction rates if the withdrawal rate is 65p in the pound. So I think we need to be really careful about saying this is going to be good. There are no free lunches in welfare reform. If you improve the marginal deduction rates for some groups, you will raise them for others. And that's really the story of the IDS reform. So it doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but it just means it's not an unalloyed, brilliant plan.
Do you want to talk to follow work there as well?
I think it's, again, I've come back to obviously you want the differential between being out of work and being in work to be as great as possible, and that will give you, or rather that is the thing which will give you the most motivation for people to go into employment. There are obvious reasons why you might not want to lower benefits at the moment, because you'll absolutely increase poverty for people who are already living on the breadline. I think when we, and I'm still wary of the debate when we start to talk in terms of people living the life of relying on benefits, because it is a complete nonsense. People living in poverty on benefits. It is clearly a miserable existence. It clearly is tied in then to this massive range of reasons why people are less happy, live much less healthy, etc., etc. That said, I think in many ways the welfare net has become a welfare noose, and just because people are extremely unhappy and people are not in a good position doesn't mean that it can be worse if they go into employment. So I think in many ways, it is a miserable position to find yourself in. But if you think like getting work is going to be even more miserable, then that's not much of a motivator. you pick on families, and of course families, with the introduction of tax credits, it is certainly true that, for example, a lone parent would be massively better off in work, and it's certainly true that for the majority of people with children, they would actually be significantly better off in work. Particularly for single men, that they would be £1 or £2 a week better off in work if they get a job. We've already heard some of the things around the employment rate for men. I think one thing I would add to that is that a motivator, an incentive is only an incentive if you understand it. And the tax credit system was so difficult to understand, and indeed was administered in some cases so badly that sure, the piece of paper and the calculation, once you spent the hour and a half doing it, they were showing you'd be better off in work, but you didn't believe it, so it wasn't an incentive, or you knew someone who next door had got a job, and in actual fact their housing benefit messed up, and the government actually never paid them their tax credits, and so it very quickly became a disincentive. So I have a bit more hope for universal credits, maybe not just on the maths, but on the simplicity of being able to explain that to individuals, making that real incentive.
Can I come in on one point that might be less what you might expect than the other points I make, which is on workfare as a leisure incentive, because in the trade union movement, we're all in favour of job guarantees and we're dead set against workfare for reasons I can bore you about as a breakdown. What we don't talk about so much actually is that actually there's a fairly hazy dividing line between workfare and job guarantees. And the key thing for us really is whether people are getting paid the rate for the job when they do work. Well, once you've got over that point, the disagreement of principle that we have becomes much less of an issue. We've never had any difficulty with the rule that has been in the benefit system since 1911 that you have to apply for jobs if you're directed to them, and we don't have any difficulty with a job guarantee that says if you're offered the job guarantee you have to take it or you lose your benefits. So I've always felt that although we get terribly het up about workfare, that some of us and some of the people who are in favour of workfare might actually have more in common than we sometimes admit.
Intriguing. Now, there's time for a last couple of questions. I'm going to take a few together. Stephen, right at the very back there. We'll do you first, and then we'll take a couple of others. I think we're pretty good.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Stephen Duckworth from Serco. A lot of our job seekers coming through the work programme will be potentially targeted towards entry-level vacancies. And we've heard this old story about getting a job to get a better job to get a career, mirrored perhaps in one of our members of the panel who got a job and now maybe with his PPS position moving in towards a career. That's a good thing, and it's sort of directed at that point in any event, because if you move someone from a job to a better job, you create a job that's available to somebody who's coming through on the work programme as well. And just as a quick aside, I ran my own business for 20 years and I was quite risk averse in running my own business, although quite entrepreneurial as well. And if someone's been out of work for 9 years previously, I'd be very reluctant to have taken them on. But I mean, that's an issue around the difficulties we might have around micro businesses. So the question is, to move from a job to get a better job, to get a career, you need training and skills, and that's been spoken about right at the beginning of the session today. What appetite do you think, as a panel, BIS should have in terms of using the work programme frameworks to procure and deliver those skills to ensure that we move people from entry-level vacancies through organisations to continue to create entry-level vacancies as they progress through into their careers?
Very, very interesting question. The marriage of skills and work policies. There's a gentleman right in the front here as well. We'll take two questions together and then take another couple if we have time.
Thank you, Devin Blaney from the Centre for Social Justice. We talked a little bit at the start about demand-side measures, and we talked about laissez-faire and interventionists. There are some that are somewhere a little bit in between the two, and I just wanted to get the panel's opinion on things like where you use, for example, government procurement schemes, or perhaps changing the corporate CSR agenda will be one that encourages people toward more employment, perhaps more and better, more progressive employment, that have the employer themselves or the contractor themselves take a more active role in pushing employment, particularly for those with additional skills needs, and how that affects others in the labour market as well.
Okay, so who wants to speak to Stephen's question about progression and whether we could run together skills programs and work programs?
Yeah, well, I'll kick off. I think, Stephen, that's a really important observation. That's sort of moving up the progression in work, releasing the entry-level positions is absolutely essential. And so that's an area where ambition, Britain's ambition has always been really poor for one reason or another. And I think it does have to get involved in that and get that by the scruff. And then we've never really cracked the skills policy side of things, though. And so the question is how, and that's why I'm quite interested in outcome-based approaches. So how do you actually do that is a really big question. On the question about procurement, I'm instinctively nervous about any idea that government should be trying to do anything other than get best value for money from its contracts. Not implacably opposed to the idea, but I think probably keep these two agendas separate would probably be better.
Yeah, on the Steve, your question, you're absolutely right about retraining people and having maybe some constant help to retrain for various reasons. I think just first of all, just one general point in that. I think for far too long as a society that we have really seen that we've taught young people as they're coming to the end of school and reaching the age of 16 that the way to get success in the world of employment is to go and get an academic qualification, go to university. And I think the previous government, increased the target to almost 50% of 18-year-olds go to university. I think that increasing that target, having such targets, actually was a huge disaster. I think a lot of people were misled. And the reason I say that is because we sort of lauded graduates, and we said, you go to university. At the end of your 3-year or 4-year term, you come out, you wear this funky gown, you put this hat on, everyone takes pictures of you, and you move from a student to becoming a graduate. There might not be a job at the end of it, but that we as a society have sort of looked at that and said academically, that's it's great, you now become something. Where someone actually might have gone and done a sort of level 3 or level 4 apprenticeship, which is actually equivalent to a degree, and they're not lauded in any way whatsoever by society in general. And they don't get to wear anything funky at the end or whatever. And they go from moving from being a apprentice to an ex-apprentice. They don't even get a nice title at the end of it. Or so I think that is just one part. I think we've just got to make sure that going forward that we recognise skills, especially vocational type skills, and the true value that they add to that individual and to people. And that's just not skills for entry-level employment, but for continuous employment as well. I think some of the changes the government's already announced, there'll be more coming through, I'm sure. It's things like giving access to the loans for studying for part-time people for the first time, to mature students for the first time when it comes to apprenticeships and so forth, at the same attractive rates that graduates would get them. I think that's an important part, because it means that even if you retool it while you're still in employment, you're doing part-time work, maybe you can go and get a skill, and the government will help with funding from that through generous loan system. So I think that's an important aspect of that. Coming back to the question for the gentleman, I think you said about government procurement, and should government procurement be used, was that your question about for job growth, or?
Well, to stop, I think the way in which I meant it was to stop the leaky buckets approach is how we're better used. So keep employment from government spending within a particular area.
Well, yeah, my personal view on that, I think when government spends money, it should go out to get the best bang for the buck, and that should be its primary focus.
You were saying a very quick word.
Right, I'll be as quick as I possibly can. When I was at school, you could become a nurse, a long time ago, you could become a nurse or a journalist with O-levels. You could become a solicitor with A-levels. These are occupations which nowadays are graduate entry. If we cut off people's ability to do degrees, those professions won't revert to taking in people with lower qualifications, because they've built up professional barriers, which are partly around maintaining their status. So you'd just be reducing the opportunities for many young people. You've got to address what's happening in the world of employers as well as the supply of graduates. On the use of procurement, I'll leave aside arguments about national government because that would take too long, but I think there is a strong case for use of procurement rules by local government. There are poor areas of the country where the council finds that nearly everything it buys in creates jobs not in their area at all. And if councils could use just a little bit of their own spending power to create decent jobs in their area, or to encourage providers to create jobs in their area, then that would make quite a bit of an inroad into the problems of employment black spots that we were talking about earlier on.
Sure. When I was a frontline welfare to work advisor, one of the people I didn't find to work for, very sad individual, he came to me, and the first time I met him, he had a box, it was about this big, and it was full of about 800 rejection letters for a job he was trying to get in IT networking. He had done a 4-year course at his local college, NVQ level 4 in IT networking, and not surprisingly, having invested 4 years of time, he wanted to become, he wanted to do something in IT networking. Here was the thing, no employer in that field recognised the NVQ4 as a real qualification. If he'd gone and done 4 years work experience and had a job, he'd spent 4 years completely wasting his life, and now was enormously depressed, wouldn't consider any other job, and was one of the individuals I failed with. It was just extremely difficult to walk him back from that. Skills provision is the answer to unemployment, to worklessness. It also does not work at the moment. It just doesn't work. Skills provision in this country is appalling. I think some of this is around funding. I think it is around procurement. At the moment, we're buying outputs rather than outcomes. So we're buying bums on seats, we're buying bits of paper which say no qualification, but that actually employers don't want. I think we've spoken about employer-led a lot. And again, here's the other thing, employers often don't know what they want. They're working in a massively changing global economy. You have to be very quick on this sort of stuff, because once you spot the gap, you've maybe got 3-6 months to upskill individuals to get a job in that, and then the job moves and the skills that you need move. So I think we need a skill system which is much more agile, which can respond to employer needs much more quickly, that takes maybe a month or 2 months to get in place rather than 2 years or 3 years by which time the demand has gone. Potentially, seem to come back to the question, should that be through the work programme framework? I think obviously doing that through the work programme framework would make it quicker, more efficient, and link it much more closely with employment outcomes. It seems like a very obvious thing.
Brilliant. I'm afraid we are now completely out of time. Ian, Sean, Sajid, Richard, thank you for your contributions. Thank you all for your questions. You remain to speak proud of you. Thank you.